Liam Lawson will rightly see his promotion to Red Bull as a dream come true, a seat in one of Formula One's top teams after starting just 11 Grand Prix, but being paired with Max Verstappen can also be the stuff of nightmares. Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon and Sergio Perez could all tell him what it's like to have your confidence battered by being directly measured against the scale of Verstappen's ability, and how that can become a vicious downward spiral that just exaggerates your shortcomings. It's not that it's impossible to compete with Verstappen as a teammate. Carlos Sainz and Daniel Ricciardo both made a fair go of it, but Lawson is stepping into probably the toughest gig in F1. At the very core of Verstappen's incredible ability is how he feels the car on the entry to a slow corner. According to Red Bull team boss Christian Horner, Verstappen's teammates are often capable of matching or even being slightly quicker than Max in the high-speed corners. It's at the other end of the corner profile spectrum where Verstappen's ability to control the car as it slides does the damage. Horner uses the example of Turn 3 in Austria, the tight, uphill right-hand hairpin at the end of the first sector of the Red Bull ring, to illustrate how Verstappen's talent manifests itself on track. Where other drivers would crave a stable rear end in order to have the confidence to attack the turn, Horner says Verstappen is almost like a motorcycle racer in the way he can carry speed into the corner totally unflustered while the car is moving around underneath him. That means the team can set the car up to have a more responsive front end and a looser rear end, knowing Verstappen will fully exploit the car's sharpness on turning, where others would be constrained by a lack of confidence in the rear. This naturally has an impact upon the direction of travel for Red Bull's aerodynamic development. Not in the sense that Red Bull has been deliberately tailoring its car concepts around the specific skills of Verstappen. There probably isn't any F1 team advanced enough to be able to do that. It's more about the development direction of each individual car. As Verstappen has found more lap time, so the team has taken its cars further down that route. Twice, once in 2020 and again in 2024, this has seriously tripped them up. Sometimes F1 drivers are so good, and it would seem Max Verstappen is one of these, they can drive around problems in such an effortless way that the team will cease to think or even know those problems exist in the first place, almost like the driver is accidentally gaslighting the engineers. At the end of 2020, technical director Pierre Gasly explained how Verstappen's ability to control instability in the car that would be impossible to cope with for some other drivers pushed Red Bull into making the car even more unstable. They knew it would ultimately be faster if the car could be more on edge. Verstappen made it work, so Red Bull kept going in that direction, and Verstappen kept making it work. Red Bull eventually realised it was only Verstappen's talent that was making this circle appear virtuous. In reality, the team had reached a performance ceiling with the car that meant other drivers couldn't get lap time out of it. You may remember 2020 was a season in which Alex Albon struggled so badly with the nervous behaviour of the RB16 that he was benched for 2021 and Red Bull hired Sergio Perez instead. And then the cycle repeated itself. As Red Bull developed its 2022, 2023 and 2024 cars, so Perez struggled more while Verstappen thrived. And eventually, even though Red Bull accepted Perez's complaints about the 2024 car and began to fix them, Perez was moved aside for another driver, in this case Liam Lawson. As cars from two completely different sets of regulations, the technical reasons behind the limitations of the 2020 RB16 and those of the 2024 RB20 were quite different. But as the team attempted to develop its way around those limitations, so it encountered a very familiar problem. And again, the recognition of what was happening was slowed by Verstappen's extraordinary ability. Correcting such problems anyway takes time, but for Red Bull there is the double whammy of recognising when Verstappen's skill is accidentally misleading the team and then tracing problems back through a complicated system of aerodynamic and car development that takes time to produce fixes. As Red Bull added downforce to the car with development, so the car's balance became ever more challenging. For a time, Verstappen could still make it work, but eventually it got to a point where even his skills couldn't compensate. Long before this point had been reached, the car had become way too demanding to drive for Perez. The gap between him and Verstappen in 2024 really began to open up at Imola, round 7 of 24, when a new floor edge wing, which increased local load, i.e. towards the front, gave the car a more forward aero balance. That's when Perez's deficit to Verstappen went from small to unacceptably big, and it followed a very similar pattern to the 2022 and 2023 seasons, when Red Bull began the championship with an understeering car, more rearwards aero balance, but evolved away from that as the cars developed. Verstappen's ability to exploit a very forwards aero balance on corner entry, with all the feelings of rear instability that brings, is what kills his teammates' competitiveness and eventually their reputations. According to a wind tunnel, the fastest theoretical F1 car has a very forward centre of aero pressure, the downforce equivalent of weight distribution. That's the most efficient way of creating downforce with the least cost in drag. But the wind tunnel doesn't care about things like drivability and that feeling of instability which can make the driver sense that the car's about to throw them off the road. So there is always a softening of the transition from straight ahead to turn in, incorporated into the aerodynamic profile of the cars to give the driver the confidence to push. That's why there is always a gap between what an F1 team's simulations tell them is theoretically the fastest way to develop and run the car and what their drivers can actually extract from that car. Often, you will get more overall performance from lowering the threshold of the car in favour of giving the driver confidence in what's underneath them. 2009 World Champion Jenson Button says Verstappen's biggest strength is his ability to drive the car closer to that theoretical limit than almost anyone else. Button reckons most drivers would find the balance of the perfect wind tunnel F1 car simply too horrible to work with, and so would adjust the car away from that to give themselves the confidence to commit to corners. But for Max, it's not even a question. He can just drive it like that. Verstappen's 2020 Red Bull teammate Albon has likened this to having a cursor on a computer screen with the sensitivity turned up to the maximum. He says when he first got into the Red Bull, there was so much nose on the thing that if you blew on the steering wheel, it would have turned. This puts Verstappen's teammates on the back foot immediately. Albon says you start off a little behind, but as the season goes on, Max craves a sharper and sharper response from the front end of the car and goes quicker and quicker as he gets what he wants. The other, more normal driver has to take increasing levels of risk to try to keep up, which inevitably leads to crashes. This is exactly what happened to Perez in Hungary practice in 2023, during a phase where he was desperately trying to turn around his form by essentially copying Verstappen's approach. The sheer difficulty of driving the car forces Verstappen's teammates into a state where they are tensing up and driving too consciously, not in what Albon calls the flow state, which is basically a natural, unthinking rhythm that frees the brain up to think about other things like strategy, racing tactics, or how the car is behaving. If you cannot reach that flow state while Verstappen is settled into his, you are going to get pummeled. Although Verstappen can take things further than most, it's not as simple as just putting more front end on the car as you develop it and watching him get faster. At a certain point, all he's doing is making it go as fast as before, but calling on more of his skill to do it. Beyond that point, even his acrobatics are not compensating and he's going slower than he would in a more balanced car. It isn't so much that he runs out of talent, it's more about how the aero balance no longer cooperates through all phases of the corner, because as you engineer in more front end on turn-in as you are braking, by inducing a bigger forward movement of the car's aerodynamic centre of pressure, so you are also inducing a bigger rearwards movement of the balance as you come off the brakes and the car levels out. Which gets you to the place which Max hates, mid-corner understeer. It's all about how much the centre of pressure moves and how fast it moves. In 2024, Red Bull's fundamental problem was finally revealed to the team at Monza, where the cars are in such low downforce trim that their rear ride heights at low speed are as big as they ever get. It was Verstappen who noticed in a data trace showing aero load and aero balance at various speeds that the rearward shift of aero balance as he reduced the braking pressure after turning in was way more pronounced than had been the case with the 2023 car. This was at the root of the mid-corner understeer that was so debilitating for him. From there, the team understood what was happening, dumped its planned upgrades and created a new one, which arrived in full for the United States Grand Prix at Austin, to positive effect. What Red Bull finally realised at Monza was that things had got to the point where Max was losing more lap time to the mid-corner understeer than he was gaining from the sharp initial rotation the team had been engineering into the car. But that was already way further along that continuum than Perez could handle. As we mentioned earlier, Perez had been constrained by it since Imola. Perez was the first true indicator that Red Bull was heading for serious trouble with its 2024 car. One of the first to be adversely affected by a car with a feeling of rear instability, his drop-off in form was in hindsight the car telling Red Bull that it was now at the point of diminishing lap time returns in following that development route. Verstappen was simply disguising that with his talent. There will be a peak in that balance range where the car is as fast as it could possibly be. For Max, that point will be further towards instability than it would be for most drivers, but go beyond it and even Max would be slower. But under these regulations, with the ground effect floor venturi a long way back in the car and the big front wing which falls too readily in and out of ground effect, Verstappen would probably not like the balance of that optimum compromise car. He'd still be yearning for a stronger front, then getting angry about the increased mid-corner understeer. That's just the way the aero seems to work on these cars. But it's a tricky point for a team running Verstappen to identify, because there is lap time there in following that path, but only up to a point. Meanwhile, the teammate can be left floundering, as Perez has shown us time and again over the past 3 seasons. So far, in his short F1 career, Liam Lawson has shown great confidence and an aptitude for adapting quickly. For a new Verstappen teammate, it's a good starting point. Team boss Christian Horner also thinks Lawson's natural driving style is better suited to the sort of pointy, sharp front-end cars that Verstappen likes. How unstable a car Lawson can live with in the way he feels it, something determined by receptors and neurons in his spinal column more than anything else, will likely then determine his ultimate fate. But he certainly has a big job on his hands to ensure his story turns out differently to those who came before him. And perhaps if Red Bull can get better at identifying the point at which Verstappen's brilliance is disguising the car's fundamental limitations, that will help Lawson perform better too, and lead to Red Bull being less of a lopsided team.